Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 112. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 112, the top 3 issues are the syntax of verse 2, the subject of verse 4, is it the Lord or is it the man? And then finally, the identity of the person whom the psalm is describing and celebrating. Is the psalm about anyone who fears the Lord, or is it about a king in particular? The first issue in Psalm 112 is the syntax of verse 2. The first half of this verse is relatively easy to understand in terms of syntax. It says, "His offspring will be great on the earth." It's the second half of the verse where the syntax becomes difficult. The second half says in Hebrew, Dor Yesharim Yovorach. Translations have understood the syntax of this line in different ways. The ESV is representative of most modern translations whenever it says, the generation of the upright will be blessed. In other words, the ESV simply reads the second line of verse 2 as its own independent clause. Dor Yesharim is the subject and Yovorach is the verb. The generation of the upright will be blessed. If you read the syntax in this way, then the verse could mean a number of different things. This second line could be saying the same thing as the first line. His offspring will be great. The generation of the upright, which is another way of referring to his offspring, will be blessed. But if you read the syntax this way, then the second line might be understood as saying something new. The generation of the upright could be a different group than the offspring, and the verse could be saying that the man's offspring will be great, and as a result, a whole generation will be blessed. This interpretation might be suggested by the NLT, which says, their children will be successful everywhere, an entire generation of godly people will be blessed. Or the NET similarly says, his descendants will be powerful on the earth, the godly will be blessed. All of these translations, however, the ESV, the NLT, the NET, they appear to be reading the syntax in the same way. The second line of verse 2 is a simple independent clause, and this reading opens the door to multiple interpretations. Another way of reading the syntax is reflected in the NJPS translation. This translation says, his descendants will be mighty in the land, a blessed generation of upright men. This reading of the syntax is a little more complicated. Instead of 2 simple sentences in this verse, one for each line, we have one complex sentence. According to this interpretation, the verb blessed, yovorach, in the second line is not the main predicate of a new clause. It's not saying a generation of upright people will be blessed. Instead, it's a relative clause, a generation of upright people who will be blessed. And so according to this interpretation, it's clear that the descendants or the offspring of the man in the first half of the verse are the same group as the upright generation in the second half of the verse. There's actually a third way of reading the syntax here. Although no modern translation takes this view, as far as we know, it is represented by 2 ancient translations. Both the Aramaic Targum and the Syriac Peshitta read the second line as, to translate it into English, he will be blessed in the generation of the upright. According to the first 2 interpretations, the phrase Dor Yesharim, generation of the upright, is the subject. But according to this ancient interpretation, the phrase Dor Yesharim is adverbial. In the generation of the upright, he, that is, the man, will be blessed. And so we have 3 possible interpretations of the syntax in this verse. All of them are attested by some translation, and all of them seem viable. So how should we decide which option to take? Well, the first option is the most popular among modern translations, and it's also the simplest. The verb yovorach is a masculine singular verb, and the noun dor is a masculine singular noun. So why not read them together as one simple sentence? The generation of the upright will be blessed. This interpretation is simple, and it also seems to be attested in some of the ancient translations. This is how, for example, the Septuagint seems to have read the verse. The second option, although it involves more syntactic complexity, you have to assume an elided relative, I would argue that this second option is actually more true to the nature of Hebrew poetry. In Hebrew poetry, parallel lines, like what we have here in verse 2, tend to communicate a single thought and oftentimes a single grammatical sentence. To give just one example, look at Psalm 19, verse 15. This verse has 3 lines. Yehyu l'ratzon imrefi vehegyon libi lefanecha Adonai tzuri v'goali. The simplest interpretation of the syntax in this verse would be to read it as three clauses. May the words of my mouth be acceptable, and the meditation of my heart is before you. The Lord is my rock and my redeemer. And yet no one reads the verse like that. The ESV, for example, says, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. This interpretation, reading the verse as one big sentence, is obviously more syntactically complex, but it's also more consistent with how Hebrew poetry works. The same kind of thing seems to be going on here in Psalm 112, verse 2. His offspring will be great on the earth, a generation of upright people who will be blessed. There's really no issue with assuming an elided relative, a who, because this kind of elision is very common in Hebrew poetry. In fact, the first verse of this psalm appears to do something similar. It says, blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who delights very much in his commands. Both of these relative particles are elided. The third view, the view of the ancient Aramaic translations, is unlikely for the same reason that the first view is unlikely. It treats the two lines of verse 2 as two independent syntactic units, and it fails to do justice to the parallelism. The third view also requires that we understand dor yesharim as an adverbial accusative, as though it said bedor yesharim. And there's no indication in the text that we ought to read it this way. And so, in conclusion, we read this verse to say, his offspring will be great on the earth, they will be a generation of upright people who will be blessed. If asked to rate the level of confidence we have in our interpretation of this verse on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in Psalm 112 is more difficult than the first, and it's more consequential than the first. It comes in verse 4. In Hebrew, verse 4 reads, Zarach b'choshech or laisharim chanun v'rachum v'tzadik. Modern translations give us at least 4 ways of reading this verse. The ESV says, light dawns in the darkness for the upright. He is gracious, merciful, and righteous. Now, according to this view, the subject of the verb zarach is light, or light dawns in the darkness. And then the adjectives in the second line, gracious, merciful, and righteous, describe him, presumably the person who is being celebrated in this psalm. He is gracious, merciful, and righteous. A second option is given to us by a German translation, which we've represented here in English. It says, a bright light shines in the darkness for upright men. Gracious and merciful and just is God. This interpretation is the same as the ESV in terms of how it understands the syntax. The only difference here in this German translation is that it specifies the adjectives in the second line to refer not to the man, but to God. Presumably then, God is also the one who is shining as a light in the first half of the verse. The NET gives us a third option. In the darkness, a light shines for the godly, for each one who is merciful, compassionate, and just. The NET agrees with the previous two views that the subject of the verb zarach is a light, but then it disagrees on how to understand the adjectives in the second line. According to the NET, the adjectives merciful, compassionate, and just describe the kinds of people on whom the light shines, for each one who is merciful, compassionate, and just. Finally, another German translation gives us a fourth possibility. This translation says, again, presented here in the English, in the darkness he shines as a light for the upright. Gracious and merciful is the just person. This translation differs from the preceding translations in multiple ways. First, it doesn't read light as the subject of the first verb. Instead, the subject of the first verb is an implied he, and the word light is an apposition to this implied subject. He shines a light. He shines as a light. Then the second half of the verse says, gracious and merciful is the just person. So whereas the other translations have gracious and merciful and just, this translation has gracious and merciful is the just person. The final and, the vav, has dropped out, and the adjective just, tzaddik, has become the subject. And now the whole verse is about the just person. The just person is gracious and merciful, and it's this person, presumably, who is like a light shining in the darkness in the first half of the verse. So, there are several issues we have to deal with here. 3 issues, to be exact. The first issue is textual. What is the correct text to be translated. Specifically, is there a vav, an and conjunction before the adjective just in the second line, or is there not a vav before this adjective? The second issue we have to deal with is syntactic. What is the subject of the first clause? Is it an implied he, or is it a light or? And then the third issue is, who is this verse even about? Who is the one shining? Who, the one being compared to a light? Who is the one who is gracious and merciful and just in the second line? Is it the Lord, or is it a person or a group of people? We'll look at each of these three issues one at a time. First, let's examine the textual issue. The German translation we looked at a moment ago claims, along with a number of commentators, that there should be no vav before the final adjective tzaddik. And there's actually some textual evidence for this claim. At least 4 medieval Hebrew manuscripts omit the conjunction and read tzaddik instead of v'tzaddik. This interpretation also makes for a nice parallel with the twin verse in Psalm 111, the previous psalm. Psalm 111:4 says almost identically, Chanun v'rachum Adonai. In this verse, the Lord, Adonai, is the subject of the adjectives Chanun v'rachum. The Lord is gracious and merciful. In Psalm 112, verse 4, if we delete the vav, then the syntax is identical to Psalm 111:4, Chanun v'rachum tzaddik. The just person is gracious and merciful. But this parallel verse could have been what led some scribes to omit the vav in the first place. In any case, our earliest and our best witnesses to the text include a vav. The best Masoretic manuscripts have a vav, the Septuagint has a conjunction, and the Qumran manuscript 4Q Psalms B, the oldest Hebrew manuscript we have of this verse, has a vav. And so we're on solid ground, sticking with the Masoretic text here and reading a vav. The next issue then, second issue for this verse, is syntactic. What is the subject of the verb zarach at the beginning of the verse? Is it an implied he, in which case it would probably refer to the person, or is it a light or? Well, there's a close parallel in Isaiah 58:10, which says, V'zarach b'choshech orecha, and your light will shine in the darkness. In this passage, we have the same words in the same order. The verb zarach has dawned, followed by a prepositional phrase, b'choshech, in the darkness, followed by the noun or, light, here orecha. And here it seems clear in the Isaiah passage that your light is the subject. Given how similar these two clauses are to one another, we should probably read them in the same way. The problem, however, that some interpreters have raised against this interpretation, against reading or in Psalm 112 as the subject, is that it would be odd to describe a light in the following line as merciful and gracious and just. Light is inanimate, so how could a light be merciful and gracious and just? Well, it could be that light here actually refers to a source of light. For example, Psalm 136 refers to the sun and moon as orim gedolim, great lights. In that passage, the noun light refers to a source of light. If in Psalm 112, or refers to a source of light, then if this source of light is an image for a person or for God, then there's really no issue with describing the source of light as gracious and merciful and just. So we've dealt with the textual issue, we've dealt with the syntactic issue. This brings us now to the final problem in the verse. Who is the source of light? And who is the one who is gracious and merciful and just? Is it the Lord, or is it a person or a group of people? The most straightforward reading of the text suggests that the subject in this verse is the person whom the psalm celebrates, the person who fears the Lord in verse 1. This person is the topic of the psalm. He's the topic of just about every verse, and so it makes sense that he would also be the topic of this verse. Also, the previous verse has just described the person's righteousness, and the following verse goes on to describe the person's graciousness. It seems almost inescapable then that the gracious and righteous one in verse 4 refers to this same person, who is also a source of light in the darkness. And so why is there any debate here at all? Why do some insist that verse 4 is talking not about the person but about the Lord? Well, there are two main reasons for thinking that verse 4 is actually about the Lord. The first reason is that the adjectives gracious and merciful, especially when they're paired up like this, always refer refer to the Lord. When the Lord revealed himself to Moses, he revealed himself as the God who is merciful and gracious, Rahum v'chanun, and every other time this pair of words is used, with the possible exception of our verse, it clearly refers to the Lord. The second reason for thinking that verse 4 is about the Lord is the light imagery in the first half of the verse. Usually in the Bible, when someone is described as a source of light, as the sun, it's the Lord. To give just one example, Deuteronomy 33:2 says that the Lord came from Sinai and dawned, v'zarach. He dawned over them from Seir. The verb translated dawned here is the same verb in our passage. Both of these points are well taken. It's true that elsewhere the phrase gracious and merciful always refers to the Lord, and it's true that light imagery or solar imagery is usually applied to the Lord. And yet, this seems to be the point of Psalm 112. Psalm 112 is describing the person who fears the Lord as being like the Lord. Psalm 112 is parallel to Psalm 111. Both Psalm 111 and Psalm 112 are acrostics, and both psalms use very similar language. Whereas Psalm 111 is about the Lord, Psalm 112 is about the person who fears the Lord. And then this person in Psalm 112 is described with terms that are used to describe the Lord in Psalm 111. So for example, Psalm 111:3 says that the Lord's righteousness endures forever. Psalm 112:3 says that the person's righteousness endures forever. The point seems to be that the person who fears the Lord, the person in Psalm 112, becomes like the Lord. And so it's to be expected, though it's no less striking, that the person who fears the Lord should be described in verse 4 as gracious and merciful, described in the same way that the Lord was described in Psalm 111 as gracious and merciful, and that he should be described as a light, a sun who radiates blessing on others. In conclusion, then, we read verse 4 as being about the person who fears the Lord. A source of light for the upright has risen in the darkness, merciful and compassionate and righteous. We give this interpretation an A rating. The last of our top exegetical issues for Psalm 112 is the identity of the person in the psalm. The psalm begins, "Happy is the one who fears the Lord," and then the rest of the psalm goes on to celebrate this one. Now, most interpreters think that the singular reference to the person in Psalm 112 is a way of referring to any and every person who fears the Lord. And this view, that the person is representative of all people who fear the Lord, this view gets reflected in some modern translations. The NJB, for example, translates this opening phrase as anyone who fears the Lord. A few other translations, including the NIV and the NLT, translate it with a plural, those who fear the Lord. This view is so common in the history of interpretation that we don't really even need to defend it here. Rather, I want to present an alternative interpretation for understanding the identity of this person and thus the meaning of the psalm. In 1989, a scholar named Stephen Sherwood wrote an article on Psalm 112. It's called Psalm 112, a Royal Wisdom Psalm, and he argued that the person in Psalm 112 is actually a king. And in the rest of this video, we'll present and develop this argument that the person in Psalm 110 is actually a king. The argument is basically that every description of this person in the psalm is especially fitting for an ideal king. For example, verse 3 says that immense wealth is in his house. Most Israelites did not possess immense wealth. Maybe some did, but definitely not most, not all those who feared the Lord. And so already the description of the psalm appears to be limited to some extent. It can't refer to everyone who fears the Lord, but only to those, or to someone, who has immense wealth. The image of King Solomon with all of his wealth comes to mind. The description in verses 7 to 8 is also especially fitting for a king. It says, "He will not be afraid of bad news. His heart is confident, trusting in the Lord. His heart is encouraged. He will not be afraid until he looks in triumph on his adversaries." These verses make the most sense in a military context. Verse 8 mentions looking in triumph on adversaries. And so again, the description here is a little awkward if it refers to everyone who fears the Lord. It makes better sense, however, if it refers specifically to the king, who was the head of the military and was often engaged in military conflict. The following verse, verse 9, says that the man's horn will rise in honor. The image of a horn is, especially in the Psalms, associated associated with David's dynasty. Psalm 132 verse 17, for example, says, I will make a horn grow for David. In Hannah's song, back in 1 Samuel, the last verse of the song says that the Lord will exalt the horn of his anointed. And so the image of a horn in Psalm 112 also points in the direction of a king. Other verses in Psalm 112 say that the man fears the Lord, verse 1, that he trusts the Lord, verse 7. Of course, all Israelites were supposed to fear and trust the Lord, but there are places when the king in particular is described in this way. Deuteronomy 17, for example, says that Israel's king is supposed to copy the law and read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes. This sounds a lot like the opening of Psalm 112. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who delights very much in his commands. A passage that describes the king trusting in the Lord is Psalm 21:8, which says in a military context, the king trusts in the Lord. Through the unfailing love of the Most High, he will not be shaken. Similarly, Psalm 112 says, in a similar military context, verse 7, that his heart is confident, trusting in the Lord. We might also mention the emphasis on righteousness in Psalm 112. In fact, the most repeated root in the psalm is the root tzedek, repeated 4 times. This emphasis on righteousness is especially appropriate if the man is a king, because the king's main job was to establish and maintain righteousness in the kingdom. Finally, the image of the man as a light dawning in the darkness, like the rising sun, is especially appropriate for a king. Look, for example, at David's last words in 2 Samuel 23. Beginning in verse 3, it says, according to the ESV, whenever one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning. The description of the man here in David's last words is very similar to the description of the man in Psalm 112. Both of them fear the Lord, they're both concerned with justice, and so they dawn upon others like the morning light. In short, every description of the man in Psalm 112 is especially fitting for a king. This interpretation also makes sense in the context of the Psalter, within which Psalm 112 sits. The Psalter begins with Psalms 1 and 2, which give us the image of a king on the Lord's holy mountain who meditates on the law of the Lord day and night and who defeats all of his enemies. Psalm 112 is very similar to Psalm 1, and so it makes sense that the man in Psalm 112 should also be understood as a king like the man in Psalm 1. Also, the twin Psalms, 111, 112, they come right after Psalm 110, which is a psalm very clearly about the Messianic king. In conclusion then, it makes the most sense to identify the man in Psalm 112 as a king, and we give this interpretation a B rating. And the reason we don't give it a higher rating is because it's not very well known or accepted, but the evidence does point decisively, I think, in this direction. Now, the identity of the man in Psalm 112 as a king does not mean that the psalm cannot also apply to others who fear the Lord. In fact, the royal interpretation encourages such an application because the king was supposed to be a model for the people. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The last issue obviously has an impact on the meaning of the whole psalm. The purpose of the psalm is not to celebrate anyone and everyone who fears the Lord, but rather to celebrate the ideal king, to inspire hope in the coming of such a king, and to encourage others to walk in his steps, and secondarily to celebrate them as well. The second issue we looked at also has a big impact on the interpretation of the psalm. Verse 4 describes this king as a source of light and as one who is gracious and merciful and just. Both of these descriptions are especially appropriate to the Lord, and yet here they're applied to a human king. The point is, and this is largely the point of the whole psalm, that the one who fears the Lord becomes like the Lord. The king is, after all, the image of God and the Son of God, and as such he reflects the attributes of the Lord. Finally, the syntactic issue in verse 2, the issue we first looked at, also has a bearing on the meaning of the psalm. This verse describes the king's offspring as great and as a generation of upright people who will be blessed. In other words, the king will have many sons, which might refer figuratively to a group of people who will become like him. And just as the king is God's son and reflects God's character, so this king will have many sons who will reflect his character. And so, in this verse, there's an implicit invitation to join the generation of the upright, to follow the king in fearing the Lord, and to experience the Lord's blessing. This has been the the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 112, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our Poetic Features video explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.world to learn more.